Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the Rustic Vaughan Lodge. I had to come up to the Rustic Vaughan Lodge again because I had to put some new fencing around some trees because deer are naughty. And so I thought before I did that I would talk about the big book of the Continental Op. A book I forgot to bring up, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. The big book of the Continental Op by Dashiell Hammett. This is a book edited by Richard Layman, not that Richard Layman. It's a different Richard Layman, and Julie M. Rivett. This is an important book because this book collects all of the Continental Op stories in Dashiell Hammett's first two novels in their original magazine version in one book. So it's a really big book, and it's important because the Continental Op was a really important character, and these are important stories. They're very important in the history of mystery and detective fiction. Dashiell Hammett, of course, is one of the most important figures in mystery and detective fiction. His work was extremely important, not just in that genre, but also in American literature. He was a really great writer. And so now he is celebrated as such, and you can find him in the Library of America, as well as all his books still being in print. But this book is really important because, like I said, it has all of these Continental Op stories and the first two novels of Dashiell Hammett, which feature the Continental Op, the original magazine versions of those stories. So the Continental Op was a really interesting character. So Dashiell Hammett was an excellent guy to write this kind of fiction for a couple of reasons. One, he was a really, really good writer. And two, he actually was a detective with the Pinkerton Agency. There are not many detective story writers who were actually detectives. Dashiell Hammett was actually a detective, and he did this for years. And so he had a few years' experience being a private detective, who was also really, really good at writing this kind of thing. So these stories had something extra. They had an extra sense of reality to them that they wouldn't otherwise have because Dashiell Hammett knew how a detective agency worked. And he modeled the Continental Detective Agency, which our Op works for, on the Pinkerton Agency. Now, the Continental Op himself is an interesting guy. We never learn his name. He is the original nameless detective. He is only the Continental Op. And so that's interesting. We never really learn too much about his background. We learn a little bit over the course of the stories. We know he has a background in the military during the war. We know that work is his life. He's a short, fat, tough detective. Little short, fat, tough detective. And he's really tough. This guy, man, I mean, as much as you dish out, this guy can take. Really a determined guy. And we learn a bit about his character over the course of the stories. And that's one of the things that is interesting about these stories. The mysteries themselves are pretty good usually, but the mysteries are not the most interesting parts of these stories. Usually the most interesting parts of these stories are the characters. There are some mystery tropes in these stories, in that at the end of many of these stories, the Continental Op will sit or stand and and explain the whole situation to whoever, which is a big mystery thing. At the end of the mystery story, the detective will explain it all. All that stuff we might have missed or didn't understand, he will just explain it. There's a lot of that in here. But it comes across fairly naturally, usually. A lot of these earlier stories are really, really pulpy. Much more so than his later work. Although his work always had a lot of that in it. Sam Spade, his detective from the Maltese Falcon, is Dashiell Hammett's more famous detective, although he only appeared in a couple of stories in one novel. The Continental Op was in a lot of stories, and he is the character that is in most of Dashiell Hammett's work, and probably is the least read, actually. Most people who have read Dashiell Hammett have read The Maltese Falcon, possibly The Glass Key, probably The Thin Man. But not as many people, for some reason, have read The Op, which is unfortunate, because I think The Op is probably his best character. And reading him this way in the big book and following along his career is really interesting. You see not just the difference in the character, but in the stories themselves. These stories were published in Black Mask magazine, one of the most important magazines from the pulp era. And Dashiell Hammett was a star of that magazine. He became one. The earlier stories were a bit different from some of the later stories. They went through a few editors at Black Mask, and every editor seemed to want something a little bit different from their writers. The earlier Continental Op stories seem a bit tamer. Actually, they seem quite a bit tamer than some of the other ones that followed. They became much more violent over time, much more hard-boiled. The Op himself became a more violent character. He was willing to do whatever it took to catch the criminals and solve the crimes. At one point, he talks about how his work is his life. He's explaining it to another character at one point, and he says, "This is all I'm good at. Catching crooks, being a detective. It's all I know. It's all I'm good at. It's all I want to do." So this is his life. This is all he wants to do. It's all he knows. And you can tell that from the stories where he frequently gets up in the middle of the night from a phone call to go out and do his job. Doesn't seem to have a heck of a lot of time off. Doesn't seem to have much of a life outside of being a detective. He mentions a few friends that he'll go play cards with, and sometimes he'll go see the fights. But other than that, his whole life is spent being a detective. And the interesting thing about that is that Dashiell Hammett makes a point of showing that this has an effect on the character. Over time, this has an effect on his morality and what kind of person he is and his emotions. Early in the series of stories, we meet the old man, the boss of the Continental Detective Agency. And the Op describes the old man, because these are all first-person stories. He describes the old man as a guy who's kind of a genial old fella who has had all of the emotion, all the human emotion burned out of him through years of working in the detective agency. He has no human emotion anymore, just because of all the awful, terrible things he's seen. He can see the worst kind of thing that'll happen. He's just like, whatever. And over time with these stories, as these stories become more violent, as the Op is put in more extreme situations, you see his character kind of change, and you'll see some of the things that he's willing to do to catch the criminals. He's willing to do things like plant or remove evidence. If he knows somebody commits a crime, but it's in his best interest not to say so, he won't, because he's trying to catch this other more important criminal. He will actually go so far as to, well, frankly, commit crimes himself if it will catch the criminal. Technically, he will do that if he thinks it's the right thing to do. He is willing to break the rules. The Continental Op is. And you see that most towards the end of the series, as you get to the novels, the Poisonville novel, which becomes Red Harvest. The Cleansing of Poisonville was the original title of the novel Red Harvest. Red Harvest is a really important, influential novel. especially in the films. There have been a bunch of movies that might have taken their plot directly from Red Harvest. But in that story where he goes to Poisonville, which is Personville, which everybody calls Poisonville, which is a city which is entirely corrupt. And he goes there because he's called there by the son of this rich guy, who is one of the corrupt guys, who is running Personville or Poisonville. And the guy who hires him gets murdered. And so the op is there now to solve this murder. And while he's trying to do that, the corrupt police chief tries to have him killed, which, annoys the op. And so the father of this guy who got murdered, like I said, he's one of the super corrupt guys who runs the town, is upset. And he's like, do whatever you have to do to clean this place up. Which he regrets really quickly, because he's one of the guys who's totally corrupt. But he gives the op got him to give him a certified check. So he can't really fire the op. The op has the money. And so if he wants to stick around and clean up this town, he can. And so he does. And in the process, he goes to extremes. Let's just put it that way. This is one of those stories I don't want to spoil because it's wonderful. But you can see in this story the effect that his job is having on the op. The op is slowly, over the course of these stories, becoming the old man. He is losing his human feeling. To the point where at one point he wakes up with a body because he gets all drunk and messed up. He has a drinking problem, the op does. And he wakes up next to a corpse. And he doesn't know if he killed this person or not. He might have. He doesn't know. That's one of the things he has to find out in the course of the story. Did I kill this person? Because he might have. He doesn't know. He's that far gone. And it's just a really interesting character arc that the op goes through in the course of this series. And the Red Harvest probably should have been the end of the series. There was one more novel after that called The Dane Curse, which is good. It's not nearly as good, I think, as Red Harvest. But it's good. It's a decent book. Where the Continental Op is trying to solve a series of mysteries all around, that all center around this one young woman. And the op has some affection for this young woman. And she's on drugs, actually. She's a drug addict. And he goes out of his way to help clean her up. And he does so, but at one point, she points out to him that, I really thought you cared for me, but you're a monster. You're a pleasant monster who's good to have around when you're in trouble, but you have no real human emotions. She says, I don't have the book with me, but she says something to that effect. And it doesn't really hurt the op too much because it's kind of true, You get the feeling that he does. He has an innate sense of decency. But his experiences as a detective have just burned so much of that out of him that is all kind of buried. And he has become a person who just exists to do this job. He just exists to be the detective and to fight crime. And everything else has taken a back seat to the point where he's, he can't even function as a human being, basically. He's Work is all he has. And that's the end. That's all we see of him. By the end of The Dane Curse, the last either series of stories or novel, depending on how you read it, Dashiell Hammett was ready to move on. He was ready to move on from the Op and tackle some more complex issues, which he does with the Maltese Falcon and the Glass Key. And those are fantastic books. But the Op is essential if you're interested in this kind of stuff. They're great stories. They're exciting stories, very pulpy. There is some period racism, unfortunately, in here because they were written in the 1920s. Probably not as awful as some of the other pulp racism that you'll see in other pulp stories, but yeah, it's in here, just so you are aware. But the stories themselves are of extremely high quality. Some of the plots are far-fetched, but that's okay. It's a really interesting, really entertaining series of stories. And I've probably talked long enough. The sun is coming up, and I should probably go put some fences around some trees. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.